Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry, plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all kinds of creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that cheesy theme tune.
Put down your pen and stop your typing. Grab yourself a drink, 'cause it's Joined Up Writing.
Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can and often does go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 116 with Karen Heenan talking about her debut historical fiction novel Songbird. So Karen explains how she broke through via Twitter. She tells us about her writing process and the joy of breaking free of her cubicle prison, so a bit more on that later. Before that, an apology from me for my absence of recent podcasts. It has been a little bit of time since the last one. I've been really busy with the day job, but I've also been focusing all of my creative energy on producing my first short film, INKLING. It was exhausting, exhilarating, but now I start the long journey of submitting the film. Great, more submissions into various international festivals and award competitions. But in the meantime, you can find a link to the trailer in the show notes, so go and check it out and let me know what you think. The film's a creepy little tale based on one of my short stories, and I just learned so much throughout the whole process. And like any writing, I had to draft and then redraft the script, but I also had to kind of break it down visually to create a shot list to make it work as a film. So I also had to really dig into the dialogue and consider how each line influences the next to allow the actors to build believable characters and scenes. And that in particular was just such a rare privilege, and I think it not only vastly improved that script, but also how I now think about screenwriting in general. Because it's one thing to read a script aloud to yourself, to better work out the flow of words, but it's just a whole different level when you have to analyse how each beat of the script could play between actors, and I learned a lot about directing and doing that. Anyway, I'm working on my next one now, and I'm hoping we can produce that next year, so I'll keep you posted. And in the meantime, I'll let you know how INKLING gets on as it progresses through the award circuit. So that's what I've been up to, but what about you? Let me know and get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast or emailing Wayne at waynekellywrites.com, as I'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. I think I'm going to be moving back to one podcast a month for a while, just until I can get back up to speed with arranging interviews and clearing the decks of everything else. But anyway, we'll see how that pans out over the coming weeks. Okay, let's not hang about and let's get on to today's interview with Karen Heenan. So Karen was born and raised in Philadelphia. She fell in love with books and stories before she learned to read, and she's wanted to write for almost as long as that. And after far too many years in a cubicle, which I mentioned in the intro there, she set herself free to follow her dreams, which include gardening, sewing, travelling, and of course, lots of writing. She lives in Lansdowne, not far from Philadelphia, with 4 cats and apparently a very patient husband. And her debut novel, Songbird, is out right now. Okay, Karen, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing, all the way from America. Really appreciate it. It's great to speak to you. So first of all, just tell listeners whereabouts you're speaking from, what time it is, and what you've been up to.
It's 3 p.m. on a rainy Monday, and I am calling from Lansdowne, which is right outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Brilliant. And so what's been happening? You're very, very new to this publishing lark, so you're only a few weeks in after your debut novel. So how are you finding things so far?
It's still a little surreal. My novel came out on November 3rd. I did a Facebook Live reading the evening before, and since then it's been a lot of spending far too much time checking the graph on my Author Central page on Amazon and dealing with social media messages that say, "Oh, I've started your book," and then they disappear for days at a time, and I have to keep checking to make sure they're still alive and breathing.
I know what you mean. You're waiting to hear what they think. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I'd rather not know they're reading until they've finished.
Yeah, I know exactly.
It's a little nerve-wracking.
Yeah, totally understandable. So why don't you start off by telling us what this debut novel is? So tell us a little bit about Songbird.
Okay, well, Songbird is a historical novel set in, well, it's always been my favorite era, Tudor England, court of Henry VIII, but it's not a book about Henry and the wives because I really think they've had enough airtime.
Yeah.
I got hooked on that period when I was just a little kid. My mom was watching an old BBC production from the late 60s or early 70s, and I got caught up in it and started sneak reading some of her novels, and it just never wore off. And the book came about from, I was reading a biography of Henry VIII, as one does, and this little throwaway fact kind of jumped out at me, and I kept reading, but I kept coming back to it. And that was about, well, the more you know about Henry, the less likable he seems. But really, but one of his more pleasant qualities was he was absolutely music obsessed.
Yeah.
And when he was Prince of Wales, he only had a few minstrels, and music was really a love of his. So when he became king, he started acquiring court musicians in a way he later acquired wives.
Yeah.
And the thing that caught me in this bio was that he was going through London as part of a procession, and there were, different street entertainments and things for the king. And there was a child singing in one of these street pageants, and apparently this boy had such a beautiful voice that the king basically had a purse of money thrown to the kid's mother, and he was put up on horseback and taken off to court to sing in the chapel choir. And I couldn't let go of what it must have felt like to be a child and to just have your entire life change that abruptly, whether it was for good or bad. It was an enormous thing. And, the child wouldn't have known if he was ever going to see his parents again, what his life was going to be like. And I didn't want to do a direct story on that specific child from history in case I encountered him later and had to change things. So I came up with my own character who follows a similar path, but she does meet the first boy who was purchased by the king once she gets to court, so she doesn't feel quite so alone.
Yeah, she's kind of one of his later purchases.
A few years down the line.
Yeah.
And she grows up in the court, and it's a story of somebody who's not nobility, but who's not really a servant. She's this gray area in between where she gets to see all the things that a servant would see and be ignored, but she's a little more raised up. So she gets to see and experience different things than, usually we get the backstairs type stories, or we get another story of Anne Boleyn, and I tried to go for something in between.
Sure. Yeah. So you obviously you have this particular passion for this specific time in history. Do you have a particular passion for historical fiction in general? Yourself reading it and stuff?
Oh yeah, that's probably, I'd say 75% of the fiction I consume is still historical, but I'll read almost any period.
Mm-hmm.
I've written in other periods, but I've never finished something to a state that I've been as happy with. But then again, Songbird was a labor of more time than I really care to admit in public.
Well, I think that's the same for most people, especially for the one that finally breaks through. So
yeah.
What is it that in particular that you love about historical fiction? What is it that first attracted you to reading it? Do you think it came from, as you mentioned, your mum had an interest in it as well? Do you think that's where it started?
Probably because I saw a lot of, before I could read, there was always some kind of a costume drama, old movie on. And then I would pick up her books, and the first books I probably read as a child that I really still remember are like the Little House books or Anne of Green Gables, and they were both historical children's literature. So even then, I just like to see how people lived in different times and what's the same and what our differences are. And really, there aren't that many differences. It's just the framework we're stuck into.
Yeah, people are people, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And what, when you're reading historical fiction, I mean, I'm not asking you necessarily to name all the, well, you can name, you can gladly name some of the ones that you like, but what is it in particular that you like when you read a historical fiction? Are there particular types of novel that you like and particular ones that you don't like? Do you like lots and lots of, lots and lots of history and historical detail, or are you more like carried away by the story?
I tend to follow the story, but since I know a decent amount of history, the history that's in the book has to be accurate, or I will probably wing it at all. And I always feel bad about throwing books these days with Kindle. With Kindle, it's a lot easier. I'm not going to damage my gadget. I'll just delete.
Yeah.
But now, it doesn't have to be in-depth history, but I like accuracy and I like a good sense of the period. I mean, my favorite historical author of all time, I'm sure she'll never be topped because she's my desert island reading, is Dorothy Dunnett, a series called the Lyman Chronicles.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a series of 6 books. And it starts in 1548 and goes to 1558. So death of Henry VIII to Elizabeth's accession to the throne. But it's very little about the Tudors or England. It's much more Scotland and a lot of intrigue all over the continent. And basically the end result is trying to get the young Mary Queen of Scots back to the throne. And it's kind of an interesting choice because I've never had much sympathy for Mary of Scotland, but I love those books. Yeah,
well, I suppose that's a strength in itself if the author is able to take somebody that is on the face of it is relatively unsympathetic and take the reader along, then that's a sign of a good book and a good story, isn't it?
It is. And Mary, it's kind of similar to my style of writing in that she has, created a character that can go in and out of all these real historical events and not disturb anything. But Queen Mary is not a large part of it. She's come up with possibly the best swashbuckling polyglot anti-hero I will ever read. I mean, you probably loathe him for the first 100 pages of the book, but the story is so fascinating, you keep going.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of 6 books, you want to start over.
That's brilliant. That's a good, as you say, that's a sign of a good book. So when you're writing your historical fiction, how do you get the balance right? Because obviously you're not. It sounds like you're knowledgeable. You've done lots of research. You're interested in the subjects that you're obviously writing about. How do you stop yourself from just doing an info dump and because you're particularly interested in might be a particular facet of the society at the time or a particular historical facet? How do you stop yourself from going overboard on that stuff, or is that just something that you pick up in the edit, or do you just instinctively feel it when you're writing?
Pretty much it gets picked up in the edits. The first draft is going to be an info dump a lot of times. I'd rather put it all in and then pull it out later, or I'll highlight things as I go along and just to question whether or not I need them. But I need to know those facts and I need to rely on that. And a lot of times my reliance on it will come through whether or not I actually ever end up using the fact. But I've built a scene or I've built something based on the info dump that I then took out later. But because it was there when I wrote it, it comes across as true whether or not it's actually visible anymore.
I see. Yeah.
But it takes several drafts to figure out how much I want to leave in because I find so many of these facts fascinating, but I've read enough historical fiction where I've gone, oh, come on, I don't need to know all these things. So yeah. I have to, take off the writer hat and put the reader on and go, how much of this do I actually need to tell the story? And, not make a reader roll their eyes so hard they get stuck up there.
Sure. And how many times, if at all, do you find that maybe there's something, it might be a technology thing or it might be a historical thing from the point of view, well, that can't happen yet because that hasn't happened or that there's no such thing as that. How much of that gets in the way of the story sometimes, or makes it difficult, if you're trying to come up with a way to get the story onto the next part, or you're trying to solve a plot problem.
There are definitely moments of that. I think the hardest part for me, and especially in this time period, is just getting people from place to place.
Sure.
Because
the time amount.
The time it took to go overland, because the roads at that point were awful. And people didn't even really use carriages that much outside the towns because they would just get mired up in the roads. So pretty much it was either people went by horseback, or if they couldn't ride, they went in a litter. And I can't even imagine how long that would take.
Yeah.
And, Google is not very helpful in questions like, well, how long would it take to go from Southampton to Calais on a ship in 1525?
So how do you tend to do it? Do you tend to have segues? Do you just sort of say 2 weeks later, or how do you get around that?
That is a lot of times how it's been handled, unless I'm writing. There wasn't a whole lot of travel during Songbird, because the few times that she really, Bess went across the channel to France for the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, which was this enormous cross-channel diplomatic meeting between King Henry and the King of France, where they got together, spent money, put on plenty of shows, and basically the peace that brought about only lasted for a year or two.
Uh-huh.
And it cleaned out the treasury on both sides. Things don't change.
No, exactly.
It's all showmanship and very little substance.
Yeah.
So that one, there was a lot of record for that. But the rest of the time, she's traveling generally with the court, so it's a little easier to plan out, because I know where all the different sites are. With what I'm working on now, there's a bit more travel involved, and there's been a little. There's just a lot of, thought bubbles in the manuscript going sometime later. I'm thinking of it like a
yeah. Well, that's the great thing about films. Yeah, you just cut away and then you're somewhere else. I mean, you can do that in books, but
and sometimes you have to, because not a lot interesting happens during travel, especially if you're just stuck on a ship with not a lot of the people in your plot.
Yeah, you can probably just cover it.
Pass, or, yeah.
Cover it with a couple of sentences. It was a long, arduous journey and then she arrived in France.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So tell us a little bit about, we alluded to it before we came on air, but so how Songbird actually found its way to publication, because it's not the sort of standard way that people might think about it.
No, but I don't think there's such a thing as a standard way anymore either.
No, I agree.
I've finished Songbird years ago, and I've written since I was a kid, but I really always just wrote for myself. It was something I did because I enjoyed it, and I never really felt the need to share it. And that went on for ages. I mean, I'm in my 50s now. And one day I just realized I was doing it for myself, but it would be kind of nice to see what would happen, because I thought it was good, but I wasn't willing to show it to anybody I knew. So it actually seemed easier to submit it to people I didn't know to be judged by. And I sent it. I did a whole slew of queries, got a lot of crickets, a few responses, and a few agents asked for a full manuscript. One of them eventually took it on. She did suggest some not significant edits, but I thought they were at the time. She made some editorial suggestions, and I thought, how dare you? But I did do them because they also weren't bad ideas.
Yeah.
And she looked for, we broke up. It was mutual after a year. She hadn't found a home for the book. She said she just didn't think it was a good time for historical fiction, and there was so much Tudor fiction out there that she didn't see that there would be much of a readership. And I think the Tudors television show was still on at that point, and Philippa Gregory was just revving up to start spinning out, a Boleyn sister book every couple of years. And I'm like, there's a crowd out here somewhere who wants to read this. But, I put it aside for a while to lick my wounds and decide if I wanted to do it again. And the publishing industry kept moving and changing during that time. And around October of last year, I decided, I'm going to give it one last chance. I'm going to read through it again, do one more pass over it, and I'm going to try one last time to get an agent. I'll give myself, to the end of the year and see what happens. And I went through and did edits, and that prior agent hadn't told me to do enough because I probably pulled 15,000 words out of that book, didn't lose a scene, and added an epilogue. And started working on my query letter, which I swear is harder than writing a book.
Yeah,
boiling several
Totally
hundred
agree.
pages down. Yeah, worst part.
Yeah.
But during that time, I had also recently got on Twitter and realized what a large writing community there is on there. And it was kind of, most of us don't have a lot of friends in real life who write, who we can talk about our obsessions with. So it was nice finding that community. And I went on December 6th of last year, and people were talking about something called Pit Mad. And I looked to see what they were all worked up about. And it was a pitch contest, basically, distill your book into 280 characters minus the appropriate hashtags, send it out there into the world, and the only people who are allowed to like it are agents or publishers. I'm like, well, that's an intriguing thing. That's better than constantly doing emails. And I thought about it and went, yeah, but your query's not done. I turned off my phone. I went upstairs to do something. And about a half an hour later, the thought just wandered through my mind of, oh, what the hell do you have to lose? And I came downstairs, typed out the fastest pitch, hit send, and then hid my phone for the rest of the day because I didn't want to look. And I got responses from 2 agents and the publisher that I ended up going with.
That's brilliant.
So I went with my publisher, which is a small startup called Authors for Authors. And it just came out on November 3rd. So in under a year, which is also pretty swift for publishing. Traditional would have never happened anywhere near that quickly.
Yeah, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about, again, you kind of alluded to it, but tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up and some of the stuff you did before finally getting into this writing career. I know you've kind of often described your pre-writing life as being imprisoned in a cubicle.
Yes, and that is still how it feels. I spent 32 years in a cubicle as a legal secretary, paralegal, legal assistant, the person who annoys the lawyers and keeps them on track. It was something I got into kind of by accident after high school while I was trying to decide if I had a specific ambition that would make it worth my while to spend the money to go to college. And I decided to get a job while I was thinking about that because I wanted to move out and get my own apartment. And independence kind of kept me away from education because I realized I liked living on my own. And since I'd learned to type really young because I wrote, I picked that up even faster and I became a very useful person. And it's hard to walk away from a job that considers you very useful. But after a while, I just realized it wasn't good for my mental health to be stuck in a box being angry all the time.
Yeah.
So 6 or 7 years ago, it was actually on my second wedding anniversary. My husband and I were out to dinner and I said, what would you think if I decided to quit my job in April? And dear, sweet, understanding man that he is, he looked at me, he said, well, I'm sure you've got a plan and you probably have a backup plan and you probably have another plan that was the original plan if both of those fall through. So he's like, I'm here for it.
Brilliant.
And he was right. So I've done a bunch of things since then. I still temp, if the budget takes a hit and I need to go and do it all.
Yeah.
I know I'm leaving. I do some online transcription. I sew, so I do a lot of craft shows and things. And right now I'm putting a lot of effort into the writing just because I want to see, if I can make one more stream of income out of that. It's also amazing how much less money you need to get by when you realize what it costs you to make it.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned about you putting more time into the writing and stuff. So tell us a little bit about your process. So do you plan? Where and when do you write? What's your favorite part of the process?
My favorite part of the process is when it hits me out of nowhere and all of a sudden I just have to start working on something. It's like inspiration really does sometimes just smack you upside the head. I was working on a second project after Songbird was accepted, and it was historical, but it was set in a different era. It was set during the Great Depression in the States, because I'd grown up with relatives who'd lived through that, and I thought it was really interesting. And then one day, as I was taking a break from that, I got this little voice in my head that said, they said I wouldn't end well. And I listened to that, and it turned out to be a secondary character from Songbird who wanted his story told. So now I'm halfway through with him, and at some point I will get back to the Great Depression. I'm not much of I'm trying to plan or plot more than I used to, because, now that there is more of an expectation that I'm going to finish a second book, I can't take decades to tinker with it until it's perfect in my eyes. So I'm still kind of a pantser for the first, I'd say 20%, where I can get a handle on who my characters are and where I think they're going. And then I kind of back up and try to make a bit of an outline and do some research. Usually I have enough of a sense of the era that I can kind of do the first draft without making any really egregious mistakes, but there are a lot of notes in the margins. How would this have happened? Would she have worn this? Had this happened yet? Who was the wife at the time, kind of thing. And then I go back for the second draft and I fill in all of the bits and pieces that were missing, and sometimes find, whole new storylines. I've ended up in a place for this project that I'd never intended on going, which is I am, knee deep in the dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s. Hadn't planned on going there, but it's fascinating.
And that's where you've ended up.
Yeah.
So do you think? Do you think with the fact, now you've had this bit of success with Songbird, and you find yourself in a situation all of a sudden, after spending so long writing and hiding it from people effectively, and not really putting it out into the world, you put it out into the world, and now it's actually out into the world and it's published. Has that changed your attitude to writing these other books? Like you sort of alluded to it there, has it made you think, I need to move a bit quicker now, and now you can see a potential outlet for these things, and you've had that?
Yes.
Has it kind of boosted your confidence a little bit?
It really has, and it was odd because before it wasn't that I didn't have confidence in my writing. I just didn't have the confidence to show it to other people and to have to not even listen to the criticism, just have to deal with the reactions. I just wanted to do the thing that made me happy. And then when I realized I did want to put it out into the world, I was going to have to deal with that. And it turns out I didn't feel anywhere near as exposed as I had expected to. That was what it really, you really feel like you're putting parts of yourself out there that nobody has ever seen.
Sure.
And it feels like it's going to be a very naked feeling, but actually it's gotten comfortable pretty quickly, other than what I said about waiting to hear reactions from people who have started to read and then gone silent.
Because you're waiting for them to finish. How has it been? I mean, I know you're very early on in the process, and I don't know how much you've kind of paid attention to your reviews, or if you've seen reviews or if you've read anything or anything. But how has that side of things been? How have you sort of coped with getting the feedback?
Oh, there's not an enormous amount of reviews so far. There's a handful on Goodreads, and I think 6 on Amazon as of this morning. Not that I looked. And so far, they're all positive. The ones that really make me happy are not just I loved it for this and this and this, but it's reviews by people who obviously are big readers, because they talk about, how how the words flow or the character development. That's like talk dirty to a writer when you start saying character study, and
Yeah.
those are the reviews that you want to frame and hang up on a wall somewhere.
Absolutely. And how have your family reacted to you getting your book out there?
Well, I don't have a lot in the way of family. My husband's very supportive. He's not a great reader of fiction, but as I did my last revisions before I sent it, the final version to the publisher, he had always known that I wrote rather, but he didn't ask to read it. He said, he assumed I would ask him to read it when I was ready to share, which I did. So he read it bit by bit before it went to the publisher. And, he swears he enjoyed it. He's not a reader of historical fiction, but it sent him to the Google a couple of times to answer questions that I would have answered later on. But,
That's good.
so I took that well. Most of what I would call my family are my close friends because I lost my parents young. So they've all been really supportive. A lot of them got thanked in the tail end of the book. And they are all the ones who've now finished and are telling me what they've thought. So I'm feeling very supported.
No, that's great. And so as we kind of move to sort of wrap things up, so what's the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice you've been given, Karen?
Probably to take the writing seriously, but not to take myself so seriously. The writing is important, but the only reason I am now published is because I got out of my own damn way.
Sure.
And the other thing, and this is more my own advice for anybody else listening, is as far as a first draft goes, just put your head down and knock the thing out because it's a first draft. You can't revise something that doesn't exist outside your head. It's going to be crap, the first one, or it's going to be rough, or it's going to be grammatically bizarre, but
Sure.
It will be finished. And that's the feeling of actually finishing something is just such a rush because you now know that you're capable of it. So if you could write it, you can certainly revise it.
Absolutely. You can't edit a blank page.
Nope. And you can't say that one enough sometimes.
No, I totally agree. And it is funny the first time that you actually do it and you do actually get to the end of something, you think, why didn't I do this before?
Yeah.
Why did I give up on all those other projects?
Yeah, and I'm sure we all have a drawer full of those other projects or a hard drive or a thumb drive or something full of them.
Yeah.
I think I actually still have old projects on floppy disks somewhere.
Yeah. It's all going back there. Okay, so you've kind of hinted about what might be up next. So where can people find out more information about you, Karen?
Well, I have a website. It's just KarenHeenan.com. That started out life as a blog I started years ago to keep up with friends, and it's transitioned into my writing website, but a lot of other random bits and pieces of me. I'm also on Facebook, Karen Heenan Writer, and on Twitter at Karen_Heenan, Heenan.
Brilliant. Well, I'll put all those links in the show notes. And good luck with the book as it goes on. Obviously, it's very, very early in the process, but it's great that it's out in the world. People can go and check it out. I mean, it's the perfect time to buy Christmas presents as well for people. So for the historical fiction lover in people's life, go out and check out Songbird. Be a nice Christmas gift.
It's available in ebook or paperback, so you have options.
Brilliant. Absolutely. So go and check it out, and I'll make sure I put all those links in the show notes. And thanks for supporting the show in the past, Karen. I know you've been listening for quite a time, and I've always appreciated you getting in touch. So thanks for that as well.
Thank you. I one of the reasons I seriously got back into writing was because of writing podcasts. Reading books about writing is one thing, but listening to voices and realizing that they're just real people who sit down at a computer just like I do.
Absolutely.
It makes it a lot more, possible sounding.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, thank you. No, thank you. That's great. I appreciate that. That's brilliant. And it's been really great to talk to you. So for now, Karen, thanks a million. And thanks for joining me on Joined Up Writing.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay, thanks again to Karen Heenan. And you should definitely check out Songbird, which is out right now. And I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.com. joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the podcast downloaded automatically every week. Also remember to get in touch with all your writing news, views, questions or comments, and I'll give you a mention in a future show. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading, and I'll see you next time.
Joined up writing.